And welcome, everybody. This is the Law and Crime Network, the afternoon session. Michael Bryant with you till 5 o'clock. Don't forget, the Daily Debrief is coming up at that time, where we kind of cover all the odds and ends from the world of the law and legal cases coast to coast. Telling you, you definitely needed a scorecard to keep track of what was going on with this verdict. It went on for more than 8 minutes. We kind of culled the most important top counts for you just to give you a sense of what was going on there. But even then, a couple of the first counts were not guilty, followed up by a guilty. So ultimately, it was second-degree murder for Joseph, and also the top count of murder for Jen Rosenbaum. The sentencing was just as odd, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple of moments. Let me ask Lakai Vinson right now, my criminal defense attorney here. When you have this many counts and this much analysis the jury has to do, it's got to be just gut-wrenching waiting for that verdict.
Absolutely. It is, Michael, and you don't know what school of thought to have. If the jury takes a long time, you're hopeful that they're going to come back with a not guilty verdict. But if they also don't take long enough, then you're afraid that they're coming back with a not guilty verdict as well. So either way, you don't know which side the coin is going to fall on. But it's certainly difficult as the defendant, but also as defense counsel, to await the jury's decision.
Yeah, and this jury did a great job wading through all of that. Let me ask you, Chad, one of the things that happened during the course of this deliberation was the juror was approached by a reporter, and that juror ultimately was taken off the panel. An alternate was put in place, and they had to start over. But then they only deliberated for a number of hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours beyond that, 16 hours before. What do you think happened when that alternate was put in place? It sounds to me like maybe they gave him kind of, or I think it was him, gave him a little update and said, here's the way we're going. What do you think?
I think you're probably right. I think they brought this new juror up to speed very quickly. Let's not forget, the alternate juror had heard all the evidence, seen all the whole trial up to that point. Once that new juror stepped in, I guess they brought him up to speed very quickly, and he must have been on board.
And they put him in a headlock, and they gave him some of this. Maybe you'll see it our way. Obviously that didn't happen, but you have to wonder how much pressure that guy must have felt. Okay, we're going to go back to some of the testimony that was critical in the jury coming to the conclusion that they did. This was sentencing, the statements that were made after the verdict, before the sentencing. Certainly one of the most powerful was from Layla's mother. Here it is. So Tessa Daniel there, boy, guilty much? Yeah, she is the biological mother of both Layla Marie, now dead, and her 4-year-old sister at the time, Millie, who has survived. But yeah, clearly, as you'll recall, these children were in foster care because the mom you just heard from had drug problems, and she couldn't handle it, and she put those kids into the foster system, and now one of them's gone, and one is probably suffering some long-term issues from abuse. So what does this mean in terms of sentencing? We know the counts were convoluted, the verdict was convoluted. Let's take a listen to the sentencing. Okay, Joseph Rosenbaum there, kind of like a statue, kind of taking it all in. 50 years for him, 30 of that in prison, and then the other 20 in life without parole, plus 40 for Jennifer. And it could have been worse. Chad Young, I did some of the math on this, and really, it got ridiculous. Like 900 plus years, potentially for Jennifer, almost 500 for Joseph. There were so many counts and so many overlapping issues. When you're the prosecutor charging in a case like this, do you take that into account? Are you just going for everything, hoping you'll get something? What's the thought process there?
Well, you charge and you go after everything that you think you can based on the facts and circumstances of this case. And if you commit multiple crimes and they think they can prove that you committed multiple crimes, stack them on, add them up.
And they did, and they really did. These kids, they're young. These defendants are young, but still, Joseph probably won't even see light of day till 50s or 60s, and of course Jennifer, no parole. So, Lakai, let me ask you. We know there's going to be appeals. We know there are going to be lots of issues. What do you think is the best shot on appeal for these defendants?
I think with both of these defendants, they are going to appeal on the fact that they had the same attorney representing the both of them, and there are clear conflicts with them having the same defense attorney represent them. Now, of course, the defense attorney should have and likely did make it very clear when she signed on to represent both of them that they would agree to waive any potential conflict, and they did. However, that will be a basis for the appeal.
Yeah, I would say, and I was talking to Chad during the break, I would have a phone book size, you remember phone books, the big thick things. I would have a phone book size file with all the waivers and documentation showing that this waiver of any conflict was knowing, it was voluntary. I don't know that there's enough out there to protect Corrine Rough Mole. I've called her the Bulldog because she's a tough one. I just don't know if there's enough out there to keep her clean on this. Chad, let me ask you, maybe she's just a genius and she figured, I go all or nothing on this defense. I'm going to get them both off, or there's going to be an appellate issue that helps Joseph at the very least.
Well, option number 2 had to have been her theory going in, because I cannot imagine how any attorney would have recommended to Joseph Rosenbaum that you do not have a conflict in this case. I mean, Joseph was not home when the murder was committed, yet he's now been convicted of that murder. Yes, he might have been privy to some of the background, and yes, maybe he did not act as he should in some of those situations, but does that equal murder? I think he had a very strong defense that was not put forth before this jury.
Oh, yeah, the defense is she did it. That was the defense, and he certainly couldn't use that. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back to more on the other side. This is the Law&Crime Network. Stay where you are. You know, there's not really any rule about what you can tell the court and what you might use as you think is, evidence to, in this case, help the sentenced about to be to hand it down to Joseph Rosenbaum. So Michael Rosenbaum brought up this little fact that Chad Young, that the natural mom, Tessa, who we just heard from earlier, she screwed this up. If she hadn't had drug problems, if she hadn't had to put her kids in foster care, then my son would not be here. What's the judge do with that?
Well, not a lot. I mean, the mother of the children is not on trial here. His son is on trial. Now, your heart goes out to a father, going through or watching their son go through a situation like this. This is their time, though, to say whatever they want to say to the judge, whether it has, effect or not.
And let me ask you, Lakai, because, I think part of what we do here at Law&Crime and what the jury is asked to do really is kind of put yourself in their position. What would you do? How would you handle this? I mean, this is, for a parent, as tough as it gets, and yet it's a procedure. It's got to be followed. You've got to do the right things, right?
That's absolutely correct, Michael. And while I'm sure that the jury sympathizes with his father and the fact that he's seeing his son go through this, they're likely more sympathetic to that 2-year-old that has died, that there's no reasonable explanation for, besides, based on their perspective, that she was killed. And so while we know the judge is hearing this father's testimony and asking that the court be lenient with their children, unfortunately, he has to take into consideration the fate of that 2-year-old. And that's what matters.
Yeah, I mean, this had to be a surreal experience for this family. And so what did the judge do with the statement just made by Michael Rosenbaum? Well, he had something to say. This is the judge in the case. So that's Judge Amaro, clearly not all that happy with the comments made by Michael Rosenbaum, the father of Joseph Rosenbaum, the defendant in this case. Now, remember, time-wise, those comments by the father were made before the sentencing. So, Lakai Vinson, do you think the judge, took out any of his defensive feel there on the sentencing? Was it already set and he was just mad about somebody kind of going a little far afield from the proceedings? What do you think was going through that judge's mind?
I think that we're all people, including the judge, and he can't help but have sympathy for Layla Daniel in this case, or excuse me, the little 2-year-old in this case. He is inflamed by the fact that the defense's family got up there and said that they weren't responsible for this crime, no matter what anybody says. And so I think that in turn just inflamed him, and he can't help but consider the fact that they're not taking responsibility. His family's not accepting the fact that he actually committed this crime when it comes down to sentencing.
Chad, let me ask you a question. It's a generic question about the victim impact statements. Do they really have an impact on the judge and the ultimate sentence, do you think? Or are they really there so that the victim's family members can vent because they need to?
Mostly to vent. They can have a slight impact. I mean, judges have sentencing guidelines that they are supposed to follow. So even they don't have to, but in most cases they do, and there's different requirements in different situations. But, the judges can take these victim impact statements into account, but for the most part, it's just an opportunity for the victims to be heard.
I want to talk again about the appeal because I think that's where we're going. We might as well look forward here on this. Lakai Vinson, a criminal defense attorney. We've talked about the grounds for that appeal. We think at least one of them, the conflict of interest between the defendants having one attorney. But what would be an outcome from the appellate court? Would they reverse and remand? Would they remand with some sort of direction? I mean, in your experience, what do you think is most likely?
I think the most likely scenario is that they would reverse and remand. The prosecution would decide to move forward again with this case. They certainly don't want the defendant to walk away from this case after a 2-year-old Layla Daniel was killed. So they certainly are going to want to put him back on with different defense counsel, one that can represent him without any interest in the outcome of the other defendant or without any inherent conflict as a result of representing both of those defendants.
So, Chad, can the appellate court ferret out or parse out a decision that would say, okay, we're reversing and remanding as to Joseph, we're reaffirming as to Jennifer?
Technically, they could. I cannot imagine a scenario where that would happen in this particular case.
So do you think then if there is a reversal and a remanding, it's going to be the whole enchilada, everything?
It's the most fair way to do it in this particular case, I believe.
Okay. And we haven't even talked about the jury issue that really bothers me. A lot of places put the alternate in with the mix from the start. Therefore, if they do need to replace them, they just pick right up without a loss. I just think there's got to be so much pressure on the new juror. Okay, that's just me. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about much more in this case and others as we continue. This is the Law and Crime Network.